let's talk a little bit about your biographical background. Tell me where were you born?
So I was actually born in Baltimore in, I mean, we can just say the year, 1979. I don't know why it matters the year. But in Franklin Square Hospital in Baltimore, which is kind of like the suburb outskirts of Baltimore. I grew up not far from there in a town called Bel Air and Edgewood, like right on the border there. And this kind of gives you an idea, a little bit of advantages and privileges that we don't think about, because while I was a Section 8 subsidized housing kid, I lived in a mixed neighborhood in what would be like considered the relatively impoverished areas of the county surrounding Baltimore. But I went to school in Bel Air, which was the wealthier white school. And that's because my grandmother lived in Bel Air, and we did that whole thing where you're like, oh, yeah, I live with my grandmother. And so you get to go to the better school, or even like the better school, a weird way to put it. It's more like the better funded school.
Yeah, well, so, I think that's fair to say. Though, knowing what the state of Baltimore City public schools are like, it's not always a stretch to say that the county schools are generally better.
Yeah, and they're better for all kinds of different reasons that we don't have to get into. But, just simply that your parents have more resources, they're going to be able to devote more time to their kids and to their school. So then you end up with a better school. I mean, that's what happens when you marginalize any group or cluster, any resources.
No, I agree. I mean, I think that's always the sort of unspoken conversation in terms of the public school system here in Baltimore, which is that even in the best of contexts, I grew up in Amherst, Massachusetts. It's a college town. A lot of upper middle class families, right? And all of those families have a lot of educational resources in the home, from the books they just have on their shelves to the ability to help their children with homework or to provide tutors who can do so when they no longer can. And so much of that subsidizes what occurs in the classroom in a public school. And then when you have, like you said, marginalized and oppressed communities that haven't had that sort of intergenerational ability and opportunity to develop that same sort of knowledge foundation that they then pass on to their children, it really makes the challenge of the public schools that much harder.
Totally. You're making me think of like a dramatic representation of this that's come up recently, which is that they're moving to like Chromebooks and things like that in school and access to high-speed internet, where you can think of even a parent that lives out where I do now in the suburbs that doesn't have as much money. Like my daughter can go, like say she breaks her Kindle or she loses it. It's like, okay, well, I ordered another one. It'll be here tomorrow. Don't worry about it. But to somebody else, that would be a huge issue that you lost a $100 to $300 device, and there would be literally no way to replace that. So even when you do help, that really deep seated lack of resources just has all this compounding effect.
No, absolutely. And let's, in terms of effects, you mentioned already that there are some differences when you grow up in a sort of county setting like you did versus the city. Speak a little bit about, your upbringing growing up, maybe some of the trouble that I know we all inevitably got into, and how that maybe played out differently for you in light of where you were living.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I can't, it's super hard to psychoanalyze yourself, but I do see the growing up in the mixed race and relatively poor area in modern society to have kind of given me this blindness that hurt me in the end. It was as a result of we had all these good intentions that we would create a society that was race blind, and was mixed together and things like that. So that's the way it was when I grew up. I mean, I'm at the edge of being a millennial. We had every kind of race. We all played football together. We all played basketball together. But not seeing that, the first time I came into it was one time I got arrested for trespassing as a kid for playing basketball. And it's kind of like they do in cities. Like in the city, you can't play basketball at night. Yeah. Well, in this neighborhood, they would they would padlock the basketball courts and say we couldn't play, which, I mean, like, this is where we lived. It was ridiculous. When we were kids, what were we supposed to do? So we climbed the fence and would just play anyway. One time the police came and everybody ran, but I stayed with another friend thinking, like, look, we're kids playing basketball. Like, we're not doing anything wrong here. So we stayed and decided to tough it out, and we both got arrested. But the cop only had one set of handcuffs. So he handcuffed my buddy, who was black.
Oh, wow.
And if you knew the two of us, AJ was the good one. He grew up to be an accountant. He is smart. He's always well behaved. He goes to church on every Sunday. But Mike was not going to church on every Sunday, was the one that was more likely to have something on him. I was the one way more likely to be a problem than AJ was. But that was the first time I saw like somebody's perception being based upon race on the state-sanctioned side that had absolutely no basis in reality. So as I came up, like I went into the Marine Corps from being poor, and being poor, you know, we float that carrot. So if you want to go to college, if you want to get out, we have that idea, like you get out of poverty. It's not something you fix, it's something you escape. So we do that as a society. And I thought that, hey, I'm one of these rough and tumble males. I'll go in the Marine Corps. I'll go be police. I'll be a good guy, but I can still be a rough and tumble male. And I can get my college education because the military will pay for it. So I signed up when I was 16 with parental consent, left when I was 17 to go into the Marine Corps. Oh. And then I see this juxtaposition now that I was a 17-year-old that was being trained to kill people as an escape from my poverty that was like created societally as well. But I go into the Marine Corps, and the Marine Corps has this big race-blind mentality as well. And I went in there, I'm trained to kill, I follow orders, I go in and you know, I'm a good guy. You're praised when you're a vet. So I get out of there and I go straight into policing, where this is the only place where my skill set really transfers. This is the place where I can go and I can have adrenaline chases still while, you know, doing that thing that society has told me is good. And so that all felt like a natural progression. I mean, I was always going to do that. I watched Cops. I wanted to be the guy that was chasing, I wanted to do the car chase. I wanted to get the guy with the guns and the drugs and all that stuff. Sure, that sounded like a lot of fun. But when you do it, I went in, and I have this race blindness that I think. So I think I have to separate myself from the good side and like the bad side. Like, so if you're a good cop, then you'll just follow the law because the law is the law. And if you just look at it that way, then you're at this objective place where you're not making any wrongs. So that's how I kind of viewed life. And I went about things naively and until that point, thinking that race and race problems were dead like everybody else. And then inside, I started to see the racial disparities that were internal first. And so internally, I saw that black cops were being punished more, that black cops weren't given the promotion. I found myself in the major case narcotics detective squad in a black city surrounded by white cops, which doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, no.
So, right, so you realize that there's some kind of underlying process that's guiding all these coincidences, you know, circumstantial evidence that you can't be dismissed until you have so much circumstantial evidence that you're like, there is something underneath of all of that.
There's no other way to describe the circumstance at that point.
Right. So I started fighting internal racism, and that kind of got me blackballed throughout the agency, trying to fight things inside of there. I got injured. I got like the freeway therapy, so to say, where they kept moving me around, trying to marginalize me from the agency because I was fighting the racist issues. I was fighting the lack of promotion issue and not educating people. So that causes a problem when you are a relatively, you know, you're a mid-level manager and you're telling the executives that everything you're doing is wrong.
Yeah, that rarely goes over well.
It never goes over well. But I always had the rebel mindset, so I figured screw it.
Yeah, exactly. Hence my long history of unemployment.
I'm starting to feel you on that boat. So after that, I had my injury for my shoulder. It kept getting re-injured, and the rules there kick you out. So I went out of the department, you know, with a relieved feeling of thinking of how unprofessional it was, how it had these problems. And now that I was on the outside, I could dedicate myself to my scholarly studies and work on improving these things in scientific literature, so that like we would lean on that, because I realized my rebellious and really aggressive stance to protect people doesn't go over well inside the system. So I figured I'd have to do this from a scientific perspective.
Now I'm curious.
And I dedicated.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, interrupt me.
I'm curious if you could speak a little bit more about what the pushback was like within the agency, Baltimore Police Department, with respect to your attempt just to talk about race issues within the department. What did that pushback look like?
So I'll give you, I think my most pressing example is probably one of the very few examples where I actually name a name.
Mm.
And that example is when I was injured, I ended up going into the medical department, which is, that's just coincidence. So they moved me to supervise medical and human resources when I was injured, because I was a supervisor and I had to be injured, so I couldn't be on the street. So after I went inside there was the case of Jermaine Cook, who was a black detective who he ended up being a victim of a hate crime that was off duty. And he said that he made a 911 call. There was these white drunk guys in the yard, and he stopped. They were they were blocking traffic. So he said, I got out, identified himself as the police. Said that they couldn't do that. They had to get off the street to clear themselves. He called 911. All of it's recorded. And he ended up getting jumped by all those guys. He ended up being blinded in an eye by being hit. Those guys ended up being convicted of a hate crime. All the it was a perfect scenario of an off-duty cop putting himself into a situation, making himself on duty, and acting under the law to actually try and provide some sort of public safety. He ends up becoming the victim of a hate crime.
Is that something you're encouraged to do? Put yourself back on duty if you're off duty and you find yourself faced with a situation like this?
Well, yeah, you're right. It's not something you're encouraged to do unless there's an imminent threat.
Okay.
You would be encouraged to call 911 or something like that. But with this particular situation, they were blocking his car, and that wasn't even an argument that was presented.
Mm.
It was a clear situation where you can be like, hey, you guys can't do this.
Yeah, I didn't ask the question because I thought, he was maybe wrong for intervening. I just wasn't sure if it was the sort of situation where he did what you were generally encouraged to do, and then he got the short end of the stick anyway.
Yeah, I would say we're definitely not encouraged to do that. But you also, there's a certain element that you have to admit as an agency or as a society, that when you are telling people that their entire job and career and purpose of being is to do good and enforce laws, well, they're going to always have a hard time drawing when and where that line is.
Yeah, definitely.
So with that case, he has all those problems, and he comes under the medical department. And I'm one supervisor. I got 400 people I have to supervise. And so a lot of things get lost in the shuffle. But this guy, it kept coming to be an issue because the deputy commissioner and a couple of the people arguing were making the case that he couldn't be classified as having a line of duty injury because he didn't have his gun on him. While he had his badge, he identified himself as a police officer. This is their argument. And I'm like, our copness doesn't depend on whether we have a gun or not. I don't understand the logic you guys are trying to present here. So we keep fighting this issue where Deputy Commissioner John Skinner is trying to push this guy out of the agency on a non-line of duty injury and not help him out, despite he does all this stuff. He passes all the requirements. Even though he's blinded in that eye, he ends up passing all the shooting. He does everything he has to do and wants to come back, wants to continue to work. So I'm not tying that this is a racial thing yet. But then he ends up calling me, Deputy Commissioner John Skinner, a few weeks later, trying to push one of his who has a completely non-line of duty injury that's related to deafness. But that guy's got 19 years on. He's one of these good old boy network guys. They all came up in the agency. It's all this. It's like the FOP is nothing but a bunch of old white guys.
Yeah.
That's the way a lot of command staff structure is as well. So in that, he's trying to get me to protect this other officer. And I'm trying to tell him, like, I don't understand. You want me to delay the paperwork on your friend so that he can get a regular pension and not what he should be getting, a non-line of duty, while at the same time you are telling me to push Jermaine Cook out of this agency on a non-line of duty injury when he was clearly on duty. Like, what is underlining this? And I kept pressing the issue, and it became clear that it was because he wasn't one of them. And whether that's overt racism or not, it was clear that Jermaine was considered not one of those real cops you protect, that he was disposable to them. And I freaked out about it. I wrote, I went to the deputy commissioner's office and chewed him out about it. And what ended up happening is that they ended up pushing his old buddy out on non-line of duty and Jermaine Cook out on the non-line of duty.
Wow.
It's like, oh my God. Like, it's one of those things you also see in society where it's like, well, we can help white people and black people, or we can help nobody. And like, our society will say, fine, then we don't help anybody. And it's like, oh,
yeah.
Wow, did you really just say that?
I mean,
so
yeah.
We kind of have that everywhere.
No, that's true. I mean, in a lot of ways, that has been what happened in Louisiana under Bobby Jindal and what happened in Kansas, if I'm not mistaken, under Governor Brownback, where, they pushed through these rules that, really at the end of the day were about spiting the poor more than anything. And inevitably in the perception of, I think, a lot of folks on that wing of our politics, those people, right? And it just tanked their state economies.
Right. I mean,
and so it was like,
exactly
it's like, rather than do something to help somebody, like, you will literally drive your entire state into a ditch just to avoid the appearance, the suggestion that you might be helping one of those.
Right. Exactly. Oh, and fighting that, what ended up happening to me, along with when I wrote it's like a 500-page guide for policing, that I also recognized the unprofessionalism and the lack of promotions in race. So when I saw that the black cops weren't getting promoted, what I also noticed was that Good Old Boy Network entrenched the promotional system as well, because what we did is you end up like giving the information, or you end up coaxing those people along through the system that are like you. It's not a level playing field. And when that power base has been established within the white supremacy and the history of policing as it is in America, then even if you have good intentions, you're executing a racist system and you're not really seeing it. So the cops in the promotional system, the officers are about 50-50 white and black in Baltimore. But then when you get to the sergeants, it starts to get more white. And then when you get to the lieutenants, it's even more white. And then it gets more and more white up into the very top, where if they make the very top of the command, they start thinking about diversity and how that appears. So I saw that pattern in the promotion. And so that was clear that there was some kind of systemic racism in the promotional system, which also goes back to a Sergeant Lou Hopkins, who had a big civil suit with the city talking about reforms and everything that had to be done because of racial disparities in promotional systems like 20, 30 years ago that they had to remedy. So that's another one of those examples where these reforms don't actually remedy anything, because you're in this exact same system that is fueled by a false premise that underlies policing that we'll go into 1,000 times on this podcast and any other discussion I do.
No, it's interesting because I think what you're describing is a perfect example of the difference between sort of overt or intrapersonal racism and structural racism, right? Because you didn't necessarily, in the instance of Detective Cook, have a supervisor saying like, oh, we're not going to help this guy out because he's black. But what you saw was the way that the department had been structured historically, and who had been hired and who was now in the upper ranks, and how that sort of played in terms of who people were willing to support, created a situation where even if at the lower levels, at the level of officer, you managed to create a relatively diverse, and I think, a police department with the number of African Americans that the Baltimore Police Department has, I think it's fair to call it diverse. It's still not necessarily having the effect of creating greater opportunities at the top, right? Which is where inevitably all of us are trying to get. And it's a good example of how racism has been built into the structure of the organization. And it's no longer required that you have actual racial animus towards a person.
Right, and I wasn't immune to that. So that's what I was kind of trying to say before, but I guess I really didn't say it outright either. Is that I felt like, and I continue to feel this to this day, I have never had a drop of racism in me, but I did a lot of racist action because of the way this system is set up. When you go back and I realized that, I was policing heavily in all black areas. I was telling my officers to go after the criminals who are classified as being black males between the ages of 16 and 24 because that's what the data says. So you get all these things in your mind and you end up executing those things, even though you're trying to be neutral or you don't have any racist motivation in the process. It's exactly like you're saying. Like, we have to take the onus off the individual because individuals you're always going to have assholes and individuals. So you have to have a system that controls those assholes. And that's where your problem really comes in. And a system that doesn't control them enables them, and then that spreads and enables everybody else.
And then staying here in the vein of not enabling those officers, speak just a little bit about, describe a little bit your current work and research and what you hope the result of it will be.
So my current research is, I guess, a culmination of diverse experiences. So what ended up really happening is I spent 4 years as a Marine. I spent 11 years as a police officer, and I got a bachelor's degree in criminal justice, recognizing that the whole field of criminal justice and like the whole system itself, it's all tied in together and it all feeds the same system. And I saw that it was feeding that same system. So I moved my master's degree into business management and information technology because our two big weak links in policing are in the management side and in the education side and the technology side. So there's really three. And so I wanted to focus on that first. And I kind of got my hands dipped into IT theories, dipped into business management theories. And then when I moved on to my PhD studies, I did it in management education. So I started to try and fill that education side and learn the theories and practices from the educational field, along with increasing my management because it's business management education. And so what that's made, the culmination of all that is a conceptual model called civilian-led policing, which the real idea here is that in the business world, successful companies recognize that all their stakeholders have to have a vested interest in the company. And you'll see, like, your big companies that are public companies, because a police department is a public company, that you end up having a board, right? So you have a board that runs the agency along with the CEO. This is how practices in business have panned out for a very long time. And we see that when you integrate stakeholder theory into this concept, what you end up doing is you create a system where it creates a perpetual feeding of itself, right? So when your board is constructed of the people who are receiving your services, which is a stakeholder theory, is that they influence your guidance and your direction. So when you have the customer demanding and guiding the service, then you are always improving the system and getting exactly what you want in a changing environment. That changing environment is really the key, because now in the business world, in a global environment, and now policing is in a global context as well, that everything affects everything else. We operate in a chaotic environment where we don't know the next major thing around the corner. So what we constantly have to do is adapt and be ready to adapt to any situation and not get locked into ideology. Right now, criminal justice is completely locked into this ideology that if you address things with force and you take the liberty of people away, and somehow you will end up with a better system. And that is completely false. There's no evidence to believe that's the case. And that system ends up in an Orwellian future of soldiers marching down your field with blind law enforcement that looks kind of like Nazi Germany, I would imagine. And you end up with surveillance and social media being monitored in Baltimore, using geofeed to pull warrants off of people.
Yeah.
And so we see that reality happening in front of us, and that's not what we want. So we want to be in control. We want to go into our police department and get the service that we're paying for. So what I essentially want is that policing now is like McDonald's, and you go into McDonald's and you're like, I would really like a Big Mac meal with a large soda, and here's my money. They say, okay, no problem. And they come back and they give you a salad with a coffee and a Hot Pocket. And you're like, I totally did not ask for this. And they're like, yeah, well, we've done some research and all of our bosses say that this is better for you and that's what you'll get. So see you later. And so if you simplify it like that, you realize that you're paying for something and you're getting the exact opposite in return. And we can't keep doing that. That's just a model that's going to fail. I mean, that's anarchy. That's tyranny. That's an oligarchy. Whatever you want to go, that's going to be an end result that we can't tolerate. So we have to head that off by creating a system that can operate in an environment of chaos like business does. And the way you do that is through stakeholder theory and a CEO to board type relationship. And you have to cut out the oligarchy. You have to cut out the power structure that has short-term goals. So, so a mayor can only have 4-year goals. Now, So imagine a McDonald's being run by an owner who only cares about how much profit and how much they can make in 4 years. Well, it's not going to work out very well. I'm sure the workers are going to get treated like crap. The customers are going to be taken advantage of. You have to have a model that sees, like the owner of McDonald's is concerned that 20 years from now, that McDonald's is still profitable. And that's what we need to do in policing as well.